The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see my own driveway. And that was exactly when I heard the knock on my door that would change everything about how I dealt with the Highland Meadows Homeowners Association. I set down my coffee and walked to the front door, already annoyed because anyone with half a brain would be staying inside during a blizzard like this. Through the frosted glass, I could make out a figure bundled up in a puffy coat, standing on my porch like they had every right to be there. I opened the door to find Patricia Ashford, our HOA president, holding a clipboard and wearing the most self-satisfied expression I had ever seen on a human face. "Mr. Iverson," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "I'm here on official HOA business." "Patricia, there's a state of emergency declared. What could possibly be so important that you're out here right now?" She pushed past me into my entryway, tracking snow all over the hardwood floors my wife had just refinished last month. I bit back my irritation and closed the door against the howling wind. "I've received multiple complaints about your snow removal equipment," she said, consulting her clipboard like she was delivering a court summons. "Specifically, your snow blower. According to HOA bylaws section 12, subsection 4, all outdoor equipment must be stored in garages or sheds when not in active use. Your snow blower has been visible on your driveway for the past 3 days. I stared at her, genuinely wondering if she was joking. "Patricia, have you looked outside? We're in the middle of the worst snowstorm Michigan has seen in 10 years. I've been using that snow blower every 4 hours to keep my driveway clear." "The bylaws don't have weather exemptions," she said primly. "I've documented the violation with photographs, and the board has voted to seize the equipment until such time as you pay the fine and agree to proper storage protocols." "You've got to be kidding me." "I assure you I am not. The fine is $500, and if you refuse to surrender the equipment voluntarily, we'll be forced to take additional measures." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to keep my temper in check. "Patricia, I need that snow blower. The storm is supposed to last another 2 days. How am I supposed to keep my driveway clear?" "Perhaps you should have thought of that before violating HOA regulations," she said. "Now, I'll need your keys to the equipment, or I'll have to call for assistance in removing it." This woman was unbelievable. I had dealt with difficult people in my job as Washtenaw County Road Commissioner, but Patricia took things to a whole new level. The irony of her not knowing what I did for a living wasn't lost on me. I kept my work life and home life pretty separate, mainly to avoid people constantly complaining to me about potholes at neighborhood barbecues. "You're really going to take my snow blower in the middle of a blizzard?" I said slowly, wanting to make sure I understood the depths of her unreasonableness. "I have no choice. The rules are the rules, Mr. Iverson." "Fine," I said, deciding that arguing with her was pointless. "It's unlocked. Have fun moving it in this weather." She looked surprised that I had given in so easily, but I had my reasons. Let her see how much work it was to move a heavy piece of equipment through 2 feet of snow. Besides, I had a backup plan. I always had a backup plan. Patricia made a call on her cell phone, and within 10 minutes, 2 guys from the HOA maintenance crew showed up with a truck. I watched from my window as they struggled to load my snow blower into the truck bed, slipping and sliding the whole time. The machine was a commercial-grade model, much heavier than the standard residential versions, and they clearly weren't prepared for the weight. It took them nearly 20 minutes to get it secured, and by the time they drove off, all 3 of them looked miserable and half frozen. My wife Dana came downstairs, wrapped in her favorite blanket. "Did I just see them take your snow blower?" "Yep," I said, pulling out my phone, "in the middle of a blizzard." "Yep. Is Patricia insane?" That's the prevailing theory. Dana shook her head and went to make tea. She had dealt with enough HOA drama over the years to know better than to be surprised by anything they did. When we had moved into Highland Meadows 5 years ago, the HOA had seemed reasonable enough. The neighborhood was beautiful, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained common areas. But Patricia had been elected president 2 years ago, and since then, things had gone steadily downhill. She had a reputation for being incredibly petty and using the HOA rules to harass anyone she didn't like or anyone who questioned her authority. I made my phone call to the county equipment depot. "Hey, Marcus, it's Paul. I need you to bring a plow truck to my house." "In this weather?" "Boss, are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just had a situation with my personal equipment. Can you have someone drop off truck 7? "Sure thing. Give us about 30 minutes. I hung up and smiled. Let Patricia think she had won this round. She had no idea what was coming. The snow continued to fall heavily, and within an hour my driveway was completely buried again. I could have shoveled it by hand, but I wanted to see how this played out. Dana had already texted 3 of her friends in the neighborhood about what happened, and I knew the gossip mill was churning at full speed. Nothing spread faster in a subdivision than HOA drama. True to his word, Marcus arrived in about 40 minutes, driving one of our county plow trucks. It was a massive Ford F550 with a full-sized plow blade and salt spreader. He pulled into my driveway, completely clearing it in one pass, then hopped out and handed me the keys. "She's all yours, boss." "Need anything else? This is perfect." "Thanks, Marcus." "No problem. Hey, is it true that the HOA president stole your snow blower during the storm?" I laughed. "News travels fast. My wife is friends with Dana. This is wild, man. What are you going to do?" "Haven't decided yet. But I'm going to make sure she understands that actions have consequences." Marcus headed back to the depot in one of our other trucks, and I parked the plow truck prominently in my driveway. It was county property, clearly marked with official logos and emergency lights. I was completely within my rights to have it at my house during a declared emergency. As road commissioner, I was required to be available for emergency situations, and having access to equipment was part of that responsibility. I didn't have to wait long for a reaction. Less than 2 hours later, Patricia was back at my door, her face red with anger and cold. "You can't park that here," she sputtered. "Commercial vehicles are prohibited in the neighborhood." "It's not a commercial vehicle," I said calmly. "It's a county emergency response vehicle, and we're currently under a state of emergency. I'm allowed to have it here. The HOA bylaws clearly state that, Patricia. I don't care what the bylaws state. This truck is staying here until the emergency is over. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the county." Her eyes narrowed. "I will be filing a formal complaint. This is completely unacceptable." "You do that," I said, and closed the door in her face. Dana was laughing in the kitchen. "That was beautiful. Did you see her expression?" "I did. I'm guessing she's going to lose her mind when she finds out what I actually do for a living." "When are you going to tell her?" "I'm thinking I'll let her figure it out on her own. Should be more entertaining that way." The rest of the day was relatively quiet. I used the plow truck to clear not only my driveway but also those of my immediate neighbors, all of whom were grateful for the help. Mrs. Henderson, who was elderly and lived alone, nearly cried with relief when I cleared her driveway and sidewalk. The Johnsons, who had a newborn and were sleep-deprived and exhausted, thanked me profusely. Even grumpy Mr. Martinez, who usually kept to himself, came out to shake my hand. By evening, I had cleared about a dozen driveways on my street. People started coming out of their houses to thank me, and several of them mentioned that Patricia had tried to tell them, I was violating HOA rules by having the truck in the neighborhood. No one seemed to care. They were too grateful to have their driveways cleared during the worst storm of the year. The next morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, informing me that I was being fined $1,000 for having a commercial vehicle on my property, and that if I didn't remove it immediately, they would have it towed at my expense. I took a picture of the letter and texted it to my lawyer, George Peterson. George had handled the closing when we bought the house, and he was familiar with HOA law. His response came back within minutes. They can't tow a county emergency vehicle during a declared emergency. Also, that's a ridiculous fine. Want me to send them a letter? Not yet, I texted back. Let me handle this my way first. I got dressed and drove the plow truck over to Patricia's house. She lived in one of the larger homes in the subdivision, a 2-story colonial with a circular driveway. Her driveway had been professionally plowed, probably by the same crew that maintained the common areas. I parked the truck on the street in front of her house and walked up to her door. She answered on the third knock, still in her bathrobe, clearly not expecting visitors. "Mr. Iverson, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to discuss your letter," I said, holding it up. "You're threatening to tow a county emergency response vehicle during a state of emergency. I thought maybe you'd like to reconsider before this becomes a bigger problem." "The HOA has rules," she said stubbornly. "You're not above them." I never said I was, but what you're doing is interfering with emergency operations. That's actually a crime, Patricia, she laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Don't be dramatic, you're just upset about the snow blower." "The snow blower that you illegally seized from my property," I pointed out. "That's called theft, by the way. It's not theft when it's done in accordance with HOA bylaws. Actually, it is. The HOA doesn't have the legal authority to seize personal property. You can fine me, you can take me to arbitration, but you can't just take my stuff." Her face was getting redder. "Get off my property, Mr. Iverson." "Gladly, but you should know that I'm going to file a police report about the theft. And if you try to tow that truck, I'll have you arrested for interfering with emergency operations." I walked back to the truck and drove home, satisfied that I had made my point. Whether she would listen was another matter entirely. That afternoon, I did exactly what I had promised. I called the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department and filed a report about the stolen snow blower. The deputy who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that it would be treated as a civil matter unless I could prove that Patricia had no legal basis for taking it. "The thing is," the deputy said, "HOAs have pretty broad authority when it comes to enforcing their rules. Unless you can show that they violated their own procedures, it's going to be hard to pursue this criminally." "What if I can prove that their procedures are legally invalid?" I asked. "Then you'd have a case, but you'd probably need a lawyer for that." I thanked him and hung up, then called George again. This time, I asked him to pull the HOA bylaws and any relevant Michigan statutes about HOA authority. If Patricia wanted to play hardball, I was more than ready to play along. While I waited for George to do his research, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I pulled up the HOA meeting minutes from the past year, which were supposed to be publicly available to all homeowners. What I found was interesting. According to the minutes, the vote to authorize equipment seizures had passed 3-2 at a board meeting 6 months ago. But when I cross-referenced the attendance records, I noticed something odd. One of the board members who had supposedly voted in favor of the measure had resigned 3 weeks before the meeting took place. That meant the vote had been fraudulent. The board didn't have a quorum without that member, and any decisions made at that meeting were invalid. I documented everything with screenshots and timestamps, then sent it all to George. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. "This is great stuff, Paul. They definitely didn't follow proper procedures. I can draft a demand letter asking for return of your property and threatening legal action if they don't comply. I can also point out that any fines they've assessed are invalid." "Do it," I said, "and make sure they understand that I'm not messing around." George's letter went out that evening via email and certified mail. In it, he laid out the case that the HOA had acted without proper authority, violated their own bylaws, and potentially committed theft. He gave them 72 hours to return my snow blower and rescind all fines, or we would pursue legal action and file a complaint with the state. I expected Patricia to back down once she got the letter. Instead, she doubled down. The next morning, I found a notice posted on my front door and on the doors of everyone who I had helped with snow removal. The notice stated that any homeowner who accepted services from an unauthorized commercial operator was subject to fines of up to $250. It specifically mentioned that I had been operating a commercial vehicle in the neighborhood without HOA approval, and that anyone who benefited from my illegal activities would be held accountable. That was the moment I decided to stop playing nice. I took a picture of the notice and posted it on the neighborhood Facebook page with a simple caption. "Our HOA president would rather fine people for helping their neighbors during a blizzard than admit she was wrong. Thought everyone should know." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, there were over 100 comments, almost all of them criticizing Patricia and the HOA board. People shared their own stories of petty enforcement actions and unreasonable fines. Several residents called for Patricia's resignation. A few even suggested dissolving the HOA entirely. Patricia tried to do damage control by posting her own response, claiming that I was spreading misinformation and that the HOA was simply trying to maintain property values and community standards. But her post only made things worse. People pointed out that property values didn't mean much if your driveway was buried under 3 feet of snow. Others noted that community standards should include helping your neighbors during emergencies. By evening, there was a full-scale revolt brewing. Someone created an online petition calling for an emergency HOA meeting to vote on Patricia's removal as president. Within 24 hours, it had signatures from more than 60% of the homeowners in Highland Meadows. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. Under Michigan HOA law, if enough homeowners request an emergency meeting, the board has to hold one within 2 weeks. Patricia tried to delay it, citing various procedural concerns, but the residents weren't having it. Several people threatened to sue if the meeting didn't happen as scheduled. In the meantime, the snow had finally stopped, but the aftermath was worse than anyone had anticipated. The county was overwhelmed with emergency calls, and many residential streets were still impassable. As road commissioner, I was working 18-hour days coordinating our response, prioritizing main roads and emergency routes, and dealing with equipment breakdowns and personnel issues. It was during one of these marathon work sessions that Patricia made her biggest mistake. She called my office at the county building and asked to speak with the road commissioner about the unauthorized county vehicle parked in Highland Meadows. My assistant, Julie, put her through without telling her who she was talking to. "This is Paul Iverson," I said, answering the call. There was a long pause. "Mr. Iverson, that's right. How can I help you, Patricia?" Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she realized what my job title meant. You're the road commissioner. I am. Have been for 4 years now. Is there something I can help you with? She hung up without another word. I leaned back in my chair and laughed for the first time in days. Julie poked her head into my office, grinning. Was that the HOA lady? Sure was. I'm guessing she didn't know who you were. Nope. That was a fun conversation. Julie laughed and went back to her desk. I returned to the stack of reports and requests on my desk, but I was in a much better mood than I had been all week. The emergency HOA meeting was packed. The community center was designed to hold maybe 100 people comfortably, but there had to be at least twice that many crammed into the space. Folding chairs lined every wall, and people were standing in the back and along the sides. The energy in the room was electric and hostile. Patricia sat at the front table with the other 4 board members: David Monroe, Susan Fletcher, Robert Young, and Karen Templeton. Yes, there were actually 2 Karens on the board, though Karen Templeton usually just went along with whatever Patricia wanted. The other 3 board members looked distinctly uncomfortable, probably sensing the mood of the crowd. Dana and I took seats near the middle of the room. I recognized most of the people there, including all of my neighbors whose driveways I had plowed. Mrs. Henderson gave me a little wave. The Johnsons nodded in acknowledgement. Even Mr. Martinez was there, looking grumpier than usual but clearly on my side. Patricia called the meeting to order by banging a gavel on the table. The room didn't quiet down immediately, and she had to bang it 3 more times before people stopped talking. This emergency meeting has been called to address concerns raised by certain residents regarding HOA enforcement actions, she began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I want to start by saying that the board has acted completely within its authority and in accordance with all applicable bylaws and regulations. That's not true, someone shouted from the back. Patricia's face flushed. You will have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period. Please hold your questions until then. We're not here to listen to you defend yourself, another voice called out. We're here to vote you out. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Patricia banged the gavel again, but it was useless. The meeting had already gotten away from her. David Monroe leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. She shook her head stubbornly, but he kept talking. Finally, she handed him the gavel and he stood up. Everyone, please, David said, his voice calmer and more conciliatory than Patricia's. I understand people are upset. We're all stressed from the storm and everything that's happened. But let's try to conduct this meeting in an orderly fashion. We'll open the floor for comments and everyone will have a chance to speak. The room settled down slightly, though the tension was still palpable. David looked relieved. Okay, who would like to speak first? About 20 hands shot up. David pointed to Mrs. Henderson, probably figuring she would be less confrontational than some of the others. Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. I'm 83 years old, she said, her voice wavering but clear. I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. In all that time, I've never seen the HOA act so cruelly as they did during this storm. Paul Iverson came to my house and cleared my driveway without being asked. He wouldn't accept payment, he just wanted to help, and for that kindness, Patricia threatened to fine both of us. That's not the kind of community I want to live in. There was a murmur of agreement throughout the room. Mrs. Henderson sat back down, and several people reached over to pat her shoulder or squeeze her hand. David pointed to the next person, a man I recognized as Tom Foster from 3 streets over. I want to know what gives the HOA the right to seize personal property, Tom said. My kid's bike was on our front lawn for 1 day last summer because he forgot to put it in the garage. You people sent us a warning letter threatening fines. But when Paul Iverson has equipment out that he's actively using during a blizzard, you actually take it. That makes no sense. Patricia couldn't help herself. The bylaws clearly state, the bylaws are garbage, Tom interrupted. And so is this board. You've turned this neighborhood into a police state where everyone is afraid to do anything without checking the rule book first. It's insane. More applause and shouts of agreement. David tried to restore order, but it was a losing battle. Person after person stood up to share their grievances with the board, and particularly with Patricia. The complaints ranged from petty fines for minor infractions to aggressive enforcement actions that bordered on harassment. A pattern emerged. Patricia had been using her position to settle personal scores and punish anyone who disagreed with her. Finally, David called on me. I stood up, and the room went quiet. Most of you know me as your neighbor, I said. Some of you might not know that I'm also the Washtenaw County Road Commissioner. I mention that not to brag, but to provide context for what happened during the storm. When Patricia seized my snow blower, she didn't just inconvenience me. She interfered with my ability to respond to the emergency. I had that equipment staged at my house specifically so I could help my neighbors while also being available for county business. Taking it was short-sighted and dangerous. I paused, looking directly at Patricia. Her face was pale and she wouldn't meet my eyes. But the bigger issue is the pattern of behavior that we've all experienced under this board's leadership. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. We're not subjects. We're homeowners who voluntarily joined an association for mutual benefit. When that association starts acting like a tyrannical government, it's time for change. The room erupted in applause. I sat down and Dana squeezed my hand. David let a few more people speak, then called for a vote on whether to remove Patricia as president. Under the HOA bylaws, she could be removed by a 2/3 vote of the homeowners present at a properly noticed meeting. Given the turnout and the mood in the room, I wasn't worried about the result. The vote was overwhelming. Out of the 160 homeowners present, only 8 voted to keep Patricia as president. One of them was Karen Templeton, which surprised no one. Patricia stood up, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This is a farce," she said. "You're all making a huge mistake. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without proper leadership." "We'll take our chances," someone shouted, and the room laughed. Patricia grabbed her coat and purse and stormed out of the meeting. Karen Templeton followed her, but the other 3 board members stayed. David took over as acting president and immediately moved to rescind all fines issued during the previous month, including mine. The motion passed unanimously. "I also move that we return all seized property to its rightful owners," David said, looking uncomfortable. "Patricia had the seized items stored in her garage. I'll personally make sure everything gets returned within 48 hours. That motion also passed unanimously. The meeting continued for another hour, with various residents proposing reforms to the HOA bylaws and procedures. It was decided that a committee would be formed to review all of the rules and recommend changes at the next regular meeting. Several people volunteered immediately. By the time Dana and I left the community center, it was after 10 o'clock. The parking lot was still full of people standing around in small groups, talking and laughing. The mood was celebratory, like we had all just survived something terrible and come out stronger on the other side. "That was intense," Dana said as we drove home. "It really was. I'm just glad it's over." "You think Patricia will actually return your snow blower? If she doesn't, I'll get the sheriff involved. She's got no legal ground to stand on anymore." As it turned out, I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I found my snow blower sitting in my driveway, right where it had been when Patricia first seized it. There was no note, no apology, nothing. Just the machine, looking a little worse for wear but otherwise intact. I checked it over carefully, making sure nothing was damaged or missing. Everything seemed fine. I started it up and it ran smoothly. Whatever else Patricia was, at least she wasn't petty enough to sabotage my equipment. Over the next few weeks, Highland Meadows began to transform. The Reform Committee met regularly and proposed significant changes to the HOA bylaws. The most important change was a provision that required the board to act reasonably and in good faith when enforcing rules, with an appeals process for homeowners who felt they had been treated unfairly. Another change limited the HOA's ability to assess fines, requiring approval from a majority of homeowners for any fine over $100. Patricia resigned from the board entirely, though she still lived in the neighborhood. I would see her occasionally when I was out working in the yard or getting the mail. She never acknowledged me, just got in her car or went back inside her house as quickly as possible. I felt a little bad for her, but not bad enough to reach out. She had made her choices, and she had to live with the consequences. David Monroe was elected as the new permanent president at the next regular meeting, running unopposed. He turned out to be reasonable and competent, everything Patricia hadn't been. Under his leadership, the HOA actually started functioning the way it was supposed to, maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and staying out of people's personal business unless absolutely necessary. The story of what happened during the blizzard became something of a legend in Highland Meadows. New residents would hear about it and ask me if it was true. I would confirm the basic facts, but leave out some of the more contentious details. There was no point in keeping old grudges alive. But the story didn't end there. About 3 months after the emergency meeting, I got a call from the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department. A detective named Sarah Martinez wanted to speak with me about Patricia Ashford. "What about her?" I asked, curious and a little concerned. "We're investigating her for possible embezzlement from the Highland Meadows HOA. Your name came up in connection with the investigation. Can you come down to the station to talk?" I agreed to meet with her that afternoon. When I arrived at the sheriff's office, Detective Martinez led me to a small conference room and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Iverson, we've been going through the HOA's financial records at the request of your board president, David Monroe. He noticed some irregularities and asked us to take a look. What we found is pretty concerning." She spread out several documents on the table. They were bank statements, invoices, and expense reports from the HOA's accounts over the past 2 years while Miss Ashford was president. Approximately $45,000 disappeared from the HOA's operating fund. The money was withdrawn in small amounts, usually a few thousand at a time, and the withdrawal slips all have her signature. I let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money." "It is. We're trying to determine if there was a legitimate reason for these withdrawals, or if this was straight-up theft." Mr. Monroe said that none of the withdrawals were authorized by the board, and that there's no record of what the money was used for. "Have you talked to Patricia about this?" "Not yet. We're still gathering evidence, but I wanted to ask you about something specific. Do you remember any unusual expenses or projects during her tenure as president?" I thought back over the past 2 years. "Nothing comes to mind. The common areas were maintained, but not any better than they had been before. We didn't have any major construction projects or improvements. If anything, things seemed to be getting worse, not better." Detective Martinez nodded and made a note. "That's consistent with what other residents have told us. It looks like she was just pocketing the money." What happens now? We'll finish our investigation and then present the findings to the prosecutor's office. If they decide there's enough evidence, they'll file charges. Given the amount of money involved, this would likely be a felony. I thanked her for the information and headed home. Dana was shocked when I told her what was going on. Patricia was stealing from the HOA. That's insane. It explains a lot, though. All those petty fines and enforcement actions were probably just ways to distract people from what she was really doing. Keep everyone focused on stupid stuff like snow blowers and lawn ornaments so they don't notice the money disappearing. You think she'll go to jail? If the prosecutor decides to file charges, probably. Embezzlement is serious, especially when it's that much money. Over the next few months, the investigation continued. Detective Martinez interviewed dozens of residents and subpoenaed records from Patricia's personal bank accounts. What they found was damning. Patricia had been systematically stealing from the HOA almost from the day she was elected president. She had used the money for personal expenses, vacations, home renovations, designer clothes, and expensive dinners. She had been living well beyond her means, and the HOA's money had been funding her lifestyle. The prosecutor filed charges in late summer. 6 counts of embezzlement, 3 counts of fraud, and 2 counts of falsifying financial records. Each count carried a potential prison sentence of up to 5 years. Patricia hired a lawyer and tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. The case went to trial in early fall. David Monroe and several other board members testified about the missing money and Patricia's refusal to provide adequate financial records during her tenure. I was called as a witness to testify about the pattern of aggressive enforcement and distraction tactics she had employed. Detective Martinez walked the jury through the financial evidence, showing exactly where the money had gone and how Patricia had tried to cover her tracks. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Patricia's lawyer argued that she had been authorized to spend the money and that the HOA's record-keeping was just sloppy, not fraudulent. But the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was not sympathetic. He noted that Patricia had been in a position of trust and had violated that trust repeatedly over an extended period of time. He sentenced her to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus penalties and interest. The total came to just over $70,000. Patricia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and that was the last I saw of her. Her house went on the market soon after, sold at a loss to cover the restitution payments. A nice young couple with 2 kids bought it, and they turned out to be great neighbors. Highland Meadows continued to thrive under David's leadership. The reformed HOA bylaws created a much healthier community dynamic. People actually wanted to serve on the board now because it wasn't a constant battle. The neighborhood started having regular social events again: block parties, holiday gatherings, a summer concert series in the common area. I kept my position as road commissioner and continued to live quietly in the neighborhood, helping out when needed but mostly keeping to myself. The plow truck made one more appearance during another big storm the following winter, and this time, nobody complained. In fact, several people asked if I could teach them how to use it, which led to an impromptu snow removal training session in the community center parking lot. Dana and I often reflected on how differently things could have turned out. If Patricia had just returned my snow blower with an apology, or if she had been willing to admit that she had overstepped, none of the rest would have happened. She would still be living her life, maybe even still on the HOA board. But her pride and stubbornness had led her down a path that ended with a prison sentence and disgrace. The snow blower itself became a bit of a neighborhood icon. I kept it in my garage most of the time, but during the winter, I would pull it out at the first sign of snow. Kids in the neighborhood would gather to watch it work, fascinated by the way it threw snow high into the air. Their parents would bring me hot chocolate and cookies, grateful for the help clearing their driveways. One afternoon, about a year after Patricia's sentencing, I was working in my garage when Mr. Martinez from down the street stopped by. He was carrying a 6-pack of beer and looking uncharacteristically friendly. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, what's up?" He handed me a beer and leaned against my workbench. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "When you first moved in, I thought you were just another uptight neighbor trying to impress everyone. Then during that whole thing with Patricia, I realized you were just trying to help people. I should have said something sooner, but I appreciate what you did for all of us." I was touched by his honesty. "Thanks, Mr. Martinez. That means a lot. Call me Eduardo," he said. "We've been neighbors long enough." We stood in my garage drinking beer and talking about nothing in particular. It was nice, normal, the kind of interaction that should be common in a neighborhood but too often isn't. When Eduardo left, I felt grateful for how things had turned out. The storm had been terrible, and the situation with Patricia had been stressful, but it had brought the community together in a way that nothing else could have. David Monroe proved to be an excellent HOA president. He served for 3 years before stepping down to focus on his growing family. His replacement, a retired teacher named Margaret Sullivan, was equally competent and kind. Under their leadership, Highland Meadows became known as one of the best neighborhoods in Washtenaw County, with high property values, low turnover, and a genuine sense of community. I eventually told the full story of the snow blower incident at a neighborhood barbecue, about 5 years after it happened. By then, enough time had passed that it felt safe to laugh about the absurdity of it all. People were shocked by some of the details they hadn't known, particularly about Patricia's aggressive threats and her attempt to fine everyone who I had helped during the storm. "I still can't believe she tried to tow a county vehicle," David said, shaking his head. "That was incredibly stupid. She was so focused on winning that she stopped thinking about consequences," I replied. "It's a cautionary tale about what happens when you let power go to your head." The conversation turned to other topics, but I noticed several of the newer residents asking questions about HOA governance and how to prevent similar situations. It was encouraging to see people taking an active interest in how their community was run. That engagement was the best defense against another Patricia-type situation. My career as road commissioner continued to be busy and challenging, but I loved the work. There was something deeply satisfying about maintaining the infrastructure that kept the county running. Every pothole filled, every road repaved, every snow route cleared felt like a small victory. And when winter storms came, I took particular pride in making sure every street in Washtenaw County was passable as quickly as possible. The snow blower kept running for years, reliable and powerful. I maintained it carefully, changing the oil and spark plugs regularly, replacing worn parts before they could fail. It became almost meditative, the routine maintenance tasks that kept the machine in top condition. Dana would joke that I cared more about the snow blower than I did about my car, and she wasn't entirely wrong. One winter day, about 7 years after the original incident, I was clearing my driveway when a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Detective Martinez got out, now a sergeant, and walked over with a smile. "Paul Iverson," she said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I shut off the snow blower." "Good to see you, Sergeant Martinez. What brings you to Highland Meadows?" Just wanted to update you on something. Patricia Ashford got out of prison last month. She's on parole and living with her sister in Ann Arbor. I felt a slight tension in my chest. Is she going to be a problem? I doubt it. Part of her parole conditions is that she can't come within 1,000 feet of this neighborhood. If she violates that, she goes right back to prison. I just thought you should know in case you see her around town. I appreciate the heads up. No problem. How's the snow blower running? I laughed. Like a champ. Still the best piece of equipment I've ever owned. We chatted for a few more minutes before she had to get back to work. After she left, I thought about Patricia and wondered what she was doing with her life now. Prison changed people, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I wasn't particularly optimistic. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and changes. Dana and I talked about moving to a bigger house when real estate prices dropped during a market correction, but ultimately decided to stay in Highland Meadows. We had built a life there, made friends, became part of something larger than ourselves. That was worth more than extra square footage. I eventually stepped down as road commissioner after serving for 12 years. It was time for someone younger to take over, someone with fresh ideas and more energy for the grueling hours and constant emergencies. I stayed involved in an advisory capacity, helping with the transition and sharing institutional knowledge, but the day-to-day responsibilities were no longer mine. Retirement suited me. I had more time to spend with Dana, to travel, to work on projects around the house. I still helped neighbors with snow removal in the winter, though I finally retired the old snow blower and bought a new one. The original machine had earned its rest after 15 years of faithful service. I kept it in the garage, a reminder of where everything had started. Highland Meadows continued to flourish. The HOA remained well-run and reasonable, focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement. Property values stayed strong. New families moved in, bringing energy and new ideas. The neighborhood evolved while maintaining the character that made it special. I never saw Patricia again. According to Dana, who kept up with neighborhood gossip better than I did, Patricia had moved out of state after completing her parole. No one knew exactly where she had gone, and no one really cared. She had become a cautionary tale, a story new residents heard about why the HOA's reformed bylaws were so important. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the snow blower incident had been a turning point, not just for me but for the entire community. It had forced us to confront the dysfunction in our HOA and take action to fix it. It had brought neighbors together and created bonds that lasted for years. And it had taught me valuable lessons about standing up to bullies and not backing down when you know you're right. The snow continued to fall every winter, and every winter I was ready for it. My driveway was always clear, and so were those of my neighbors who needed help. The work was cold and tiring, but it felt good to be useful, to know that I was making a difference in small but meaningful ways. Dana would sometimes watch me from the window, shaking her head and smiling. She knew what the snow blower meant to me, why I took such care of it and used it so faithfully. It wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of everything we had fought for and won. It represented the kind of community we wanted to live in, where neighbors helped each other and petty tyrants were held accountable for their actions. As I got older, I thought more about legacy and what we leave behind. I didn't have children, so there would be no one to inherit my stories or remember the details of my life. But I took comfort in knowing that I had made my corner of the world a little better. The roads I had maintained, the neighbors I had helped, the stand I had taken against injustice, these things mattered even if they weren't remembered forever. Highland Meadows was my legacy in a way. The community that had emerged from the ashes of Patricia's tyranny was stronger, kinder, and more resilient than it had been before. People looked out for each other. They got involved in HOA governance. They didn't let power-hungry individuals take control without accountability. That culture would outlast me, and that was enough. The snowblower sat in my garage, ready for the next storm. I kept it maintained and prepared, just as I had been taught. Winter would come again, as it always did, and I would be ready. That was the lesson I had learned through all of this. Preparedness, persistence, and principled action could overcome almost any challenge. And if another HOA Karen ever tried to seize my equipment during a blizzard, well, at least I would know exactly how to handle it. Some lessons you only have to learn once.